Understanding presidential politics begins with the Electoral College, that peculiar device still used to select the chief executive. In their conception of the Electoral College, the framers foresaw an elite group of well-qualified electors exercising their collective judgment in picking the best qualified president and vice president from an open field of leading figures from across the country. And there was no question who was the leading figure. Through this process, the framers hoped to avoid both the formation of national political parties, which were never mentioned in the Constitution, and the development of coordinated factional voting in Congress. As the framers designed the system, each elector would cast 2 equal votes, one for each of their 2 top choices for president. The candidate with the most votes from at least the majority of the electors would become president, and the runner-up would become vice president. Electors were not permitted to designate on their ballots one vote for president and another vote for vice president, however, and they could not vote for 2 candidates from their own state. The framers included these stipulations, which bedeviled the system for a generation, as stipulations to prevent state loyalties from overcoming national interest in choosing the president. That process actually worked quite well in 1789 and 1792, when George Washington was the clear favorite of all the electors. Aside from an elderly Benjamin Franklin, who died at age 89 in 1790, Washington was America's only truly national hero, the one indispensable person for forming the new government. After Washington declined to stand for a 3rd term in 1796, the tradition of not campaigning for president continued, but much else had changed. The nation's 2 ideological factions had been evolving into more organized political parties. In 1796, partisans of the ruling Federalist faction, which is the ideological aim of the modern Republican Party, agreed on Adams for president. In their caucus, opposition Democrats uniformly backed Thomas Jefferson. The differences dividing the 2 leading factions in early American politics reflected a deepening ideological rift. Whether the national government could charter a bank, effectively the Federal Reserve we're talking about here, and thus create a national banking system became an especially heated issue, for example. Many doubted if the new national government would long survive. Vice President John Adams and those calling themselves Federalists saw a strong central government led by a powerful president as vital for a prosperous, secure nation. Strong proponents of this viewpoint, like Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, who favored transferring virtually all power to the national government and consolidating it in a strong executive and aristocratic Senate, became known as the High Federalists. At the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton had unabashedly depicted the monarchical British government as, quote, the best in the world, and famously proposed life tenure for the president and for all senators. Now, Jefferson trusted popular rule and distrusted elite institutions. By 1792, Virginia Congressman James Madison, and prime architect of our Constitution, who always acted as on Jefferson's behalf in such matters, was calling for a formal political party to oppose Hamilton and his followers. Well, organizing on the left precipitated organizing on the right, and soon the outlines of America's 2-party system emerged in the rise of partisan newspapers, the coordination of voting by members of Congress, party endorsements for political candidates, and state party structures. During the early 1790s, a raging and widespread war between Royalists and Republicans in Europe intensified partisan tensions in America. The European War had its roots in the violent fall of the monarchy and rise of Republican rule in France, which Jefferson initially embraced as the birth pains of liberty in Europe.
On hand as the American ambassador in Paris at the beginning of the French Revolution, this was before he became Secretary of State, Jefferson welcomed these developments despite the worsening violence. He remained in Paris long enough to witness this sight, that is, the fall of the Royal Bastille prison to the revolutionaries on July 14, 1789. Quote from Jefferson's letter, official letter, as ambassador to the American government. They took all the arms, discharged the prisoners, and carried the prison's governor and lieutenant governor to the place of public execution. They cut off their heads and sent them through the city in triumph. Jefferson naively predicted that a constitutional monarchy with broad individual rights would quickly emerge from the ashes of absolute rule in France. Viewing such events through the lens of the American Revolution, Jefferson saw only better times ahead. As Secretary of State, Jefferson continued to side with the revolutionaries in France, even as the violence there spiraled out of control. Priests were massacred for their faith and driven from the realm. Nobles fled too, and their property was confiscated. Protesters fell by the tens of thousands in military reactions, and the king and queen were guillotined. And a reign of terror descended on France with the mass execution of supposed counter-revolutionaries.
France horrified Federalists in the United States and conservatives throughout Europe. And here's their drawing of the execution of the king with the satanic devils floating around. Royalist regimes led by Prussia and Austria responded by invading France in 1791 to restore the old order. Inspired by visions of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the French armies pushed back those invading forces and began spreading republicanism to nearby point. The differing views of Federalists and Democrats in America regarding the bloody course of events in Europe complicated Washington's efforts to lead by consensus. Those labors became wholly futile after 1794, when Britain joined the alliance against France and carried war to America's doorstep with sea battles in the North Atlantic and Caribbean. Pressure built for the United States to choose between its principal trading partner, Britain, and its Revolutionary War ally, France. Both sides demanded support from other nations and retaliated, often violently, against those that refused aid, including the United States, and began intercepting ships from the United States and other supposedly neutral countries on their way to enemy ports. Washington tried to maintain American neutrality, but after Jefferson's resignation as Secretary of State in 1793, his administration increasingly came under control of Hamilton's pro-British High Federalists. British naval vessels began intercepting American ships bound to or from French ports and impressing American sailors into service in the Royal Navy. George Washington dispatched Chief Justice John Jay to resolve differences between the United States and Britain. Bargaining from a very weak position, Jay's controversial British treaty did little more than accept British limits on American trade with France in exchange for Britain finally evacuating its forts on U.S. territory, something that it had promised at the end of the Revolution. Jay's treaty even failed to stop the British from intercepting American merchant ships on the high seas and from impressing American sailors when they did so. The agreement outraged both Democrats at home and the French government, which retaliated by authorizing the capture of American ships trading with Britain. The fledgling United States had no means to protect its merchant fleet, which was now regular prey to both the British and the French. Well, his hopes for a nonpartisan government dashed, Washington stood down in 1796, and Adams narrowly bested Jefferson in America's first contested presidential election. Without Washington's unifying figure at the helm, however, partisanship gripped the nation's politics. The ongoing threat from France simply made matters worse. By the time Adams took office in 1797, French naval vessels and privateers had intercepted hundreds of American merchant ships in retaliation for Jay's Treaty. Soon rumors spread of an imminent invasion by France, which raised the specter of revolutionary terror engulfing the new republic. The rumor was, and it turned out widely spread by Federalists, was that an army of freed blacks from Haiti would invade Georgia and then march up, rising a slave revolt and bringing Republican rule, that is, revolution, to Georgia, then South Carolina and North Carolina, and march up as far as they could get. That was the rumor. Well, as wild as this sounds, the threat seemed realistic to some frightened Americans, though actually never to John Adams, and most assuredly never to any of the leading Democrats. At that time, French's Revolutionary Army had overrun much of Europe, dislodging long-established political, economic, and religious institutions as they went: the Netherlands, the Low Countries, parts of Germany, northern Italy, Spain. America was next, some Federalists warned. They expressly played on the concerns of American Christians, who feared that the results on religion in France might spread to our country. Although many prominent Federalists were not themselves, as cultural conservatives, they valued the role of religion in society. This further differentiated them from Jefferson and other Democrats who, while typically retaining a broad-minded belief in God, favored the separation of church and state as a core human right. In the increasing vicious political exchanges of the late 1790s, Federalists damned Democrats as virtual atheists who would undermine American Christian values, while Democrats charged that Federalists sought to establish a state church. France became the focus of Federalist fears. To counter the impact of French attacks on American shipping, Adams proposed and Congress approved raising war taxes, building a navy, and engaging French ships on the high seas. And this was the most famous of the ships built in that effort. It was called the USS Constitution. It's now widely known as Old Ironsides. And it was to fight the French at this time. Addressing the risk of a French invasion, Federalists in Congress also passed legislation tripling the size of their regular army, with the new troops to be stationed in the populated eastern seaboard. At that time, the only American troops were stationed out on the frontier to guard against attacks by Native Americans. Now troops were going to be stationed right along the coast, ostensibly to protect against the French invasion. Suspicious of Federalist intentions to create a strong central government and positively disposed toward France, Republicans saw a domestic army as a clear and imminent threat to states' rights and individual liberty. Party newspapers portrayed it as the first step toward an American monarchy. Well, the partisan clashes over American policy toward France intensified in 1798, when Federalists turned to matters of internal security and wartime. They claimed that the French government might actually whip up support among its American advisors if they invaded, especially among Democrats and recent immigrants. French armies had, in fact, relied on local Republicans and resident aliens for help in conquering European territory. Federalists charged that they might do the same in America if they invaded. Democrats dismissed this as impossible and feared that the Federalists simply wanted to clamp down on domestic dissent. Nevertheless, in 1798, at the height of the popular concern over a French invasion, high Federalists pushed through Congress the Naturalization, Alien, and Sedition Acts. These laws raised the bar for citizenship, authorized the deportation of foreigners, and outlawed false and malicious criticism of the government in the press or by individuals, and they were enforced by this man, the Secretary of State, Thomas Pickering. Despite these reverses, indeed perhaps because of them, the Democratic opposition gained traction in 1799 and 1800. The naval war with France, which proved exceedingly costly and further disrupted foreign trade, led to a soaring national debt and the collection of ever more taxes, which many Americans resented. Partisan attacks on Adams took their toll as the public began to realize that, despite the ongoing naval clashes, and there were hundreds of them, France was not going to invade. Before long, the Sedition Acts and the enlarged army began to seem to many Americans as unnecessary and unwise. Democrats painted them as a calculated steps toward imposing an authoritarian regime in the United States. As the 1800 presidential election approached, the stage was set for America's first and most transformative national political campaign. In that election, two organized parties did battle, with Jefferson eking out a narrow victory, leading to the first ever peaceful transition of power between different political parties. This episode, more than anything that preceded him, laid the basis for the ensuing political developments in the United States. Two political parties became the buttress, indeed the bulwark, of American democracy, rather than the bane of it, as Washington and the founders had feared. Even the basic ideologies of the two parties were pretty much set, with modern Republicans following Federalists to support a strong executive and military as a means to promote economic development, national security, and traditional moral values, while Democrats remained open to the sort of social and political innovations that intrigued Jefferson. In 1800, partisans on both sides viewed their party's policies as vital to maintain American liberty in a turbulent world. They still do. Those who experienced this tumultuous birth of America's two-party system may have called it a catastrophe, but I title my book about it Magnificent. Partly because, indeed principally because, of the system of government that grew out of it. For all of its faults, and indeed they often seem many, for all of those faults, there is no system of government in the world today that has a better track record of endurance and of practical success than ours. A magnificent catastrophe indeed, the election of 1800. Thank you. Now, I have tried to leave ample time for questions if you want questions about the actual election. I wanted to introduce the process. Oh, and that should have closed with Jefferson's picture. Wanted to set up the stage. But the election itself is a tumultuous event, as I've said, one that people call a catastrophe. And what I do in my book, after introducing the story, is I try to model it, because no one had ever written a book about the 1800 election that follows, that tracks what actually happened. There are several books about it that talk about it in this broad context and its tremendous historic significance. But I used as my model Theodore White's Making of a President, 1960, and where literally after the introduction, each chapter covers 2 months, because the election was spread out over a whole calendar year, because at the same time, every state got to vote or choose their electors whenever they wanted to. And so, and nobody knew who was going to win. It was a total toss-up. In fact, after everybody voted and before the news reached the capital from the various states, both sides thought they had won. Well, at least the optimists on both sides. The pessimists on both sides thought they'd both lost. And it was like, if you remember the year 2000, watching the results coming in for Bush versus Gore, if you want to spread that over a year, the newspapers would all follow the known electoral votes, and they'd have these little columns every day in the newspaper showing the vote in the states. And it just kept building over a whole calendar year as states would
choose their electors. And I follow the campaign in each state through the newspapers, through the letters people are writing, and tell that story, because that's the story that no historian had ever really gone back and tried to follow that track and follow the episodes. And it was through that, following that episodes, that the tumultuous nature and the divisions and the angst that people felt during that year. Because if you could imagine it, that night of Bush versus Gore had gone on for a calendar year, and when you thought it was so, if you also thought it was so important who won, how that would create a lot of national anxiety and tension. And so that's the story I'm trying to tell, but I'd be delighted to take questions if you have questions about any parts of them. Yes, sir. The election was interesting because the people back then knew that it was a crucial election going into it. And they hadn't envisioned political parties, and they knew they were being created. And they knew that a new system of government was being formed on the fly in America. They all knew that. Literally everybody comes back out and gets involved. Those who had been involved in the Revolution, who are still alive, and those who were involved in the Constitutional Convention or in the founding process. Many of them long retired. George Clinton, the longtime governor of New York, had retired. Horatio Gates, the hero of the goat of Camden and the hero of Saratoga. Samuel Adams is very involved in the campaign. George Washington is extremely involved in the campaign until he dies. Madison, Monroe, Hamilton, John Jay, John Marshall is very involved. And George Wythe runs as an elector in Virginia, which is absolutely phenomenal given his age and given his stature to run for a job of elector. Well, one of the main people who come out and get involved was Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr had been a colonel in the American Revolution and was a profoundly ambitious person. He'd been a U.S. senator. He was grandson of Jonathan Edwards, a famous theologian, on his mother's side. He'd gone to Princeton. He'd been, as I say, a colonel in the Revolutionary War, and he was profoundly ambitious. And he was a brilliant political organizer. But he was not very ideological. Unlike most of these people were deeply involved for ideological reasons. Jefferson really believed in his cause and his side. Adams did. Clinton did. George Clinton did. McCain did in Pennsylvania. These were heroes of the Revolution coming back out. Samuel Adams cared deeply. Elderbridge Gerry. Burr was self-ambitious. And he loved politics. And he knew he'd flirted with running as a Federalist at different times, but he'd served as a Republican in the U.S. Senate. That called Republican became the Democrat. So he's a Democrat in the U.S. Senate. And everyone knew that back then there was a group of states that were going to vote for Jefferson. Jefferson had only lost in 1796, even before all the crises, partisanship crises of Adams' administration and all of Adams' problems. He had only lost by 2 electoral votes. And it was going to be close again. And the decisive states, just like today it's Ohio and Florida, back then were the middle states. Pennsylvania and New York, the most key, and South Carolina to a lesser extent. Those were the battleground states. Maryland was important too. But Adams had won New York. And Adams' party dominated in the New York legislature, and the governor was John Jay. Their U.S. senator was Gouverneur Morris. And Hamilton lived there and was command of this army, the enlarged army. Hamilton was the commander of the army, and he based his headquarters there and had the army there. And Burr knew that the only way, and all the Democrats would agree, the only way that Jefferson had a chance was to take New York. It's the only way he had a chance. And even with it, it wasn't sure. But if he lost New York, and New York voted relatively early. It wasn't the first state, but it voted in April. So April, last 2 days of April, first day of May. And so we're talking well before the elections that in November, take place in November, where some of them did. So about in the early third. And that would set the stage. And if Adams won that, it was all over. And so, the Federalists had a strong lead. And Aaron Burr commits himself to winning that state and taking it over, because there, in that state, the electors chose the electors. The legislature chose the electors. And so the key became winning the state legislature in the April election. And whoever won the state legislature that year would appoint the electors. And so he said, and the way it was set up is the New York City delegation would control whoever, because the way the whole rest of the state is. So he set himself up. He ran for the state legislature in a different county, so he could spend all his time focusing on New York. And he became convinced to, and they run statewide, so you win all 13 assembly votes if you win the New York City elections, even by one vote. And the Federalists had won them big 4 years before, or 2 years before, I guess it would have been 2 years before. And he set about to do it. And there's a classic battle that the whole nation watched as Aaron Burr set up the first political machine, urban political machine, based on Tammany Hall, the initial of the Tammany machine, in New York for that election. And he thought about it a year ahead of time, year ahead of them. He got the legislature, when he was in the state legislature, to approve a alternative banking system that he snuck through as part of a water bill, a water company, but that had the power to loan money. The only banks were Federalist banks, and everybody was afraid to not support the Federalists or they'd lose their line of credit. He created an alternative banking and then once he had that, so people had an alternative line, he broke the city up into districts and wards. He appointed people. He appointed organized committees. He taxed people who borrowed money from his bank, and also taxed potential Republicans based on their wealth, so they had to give contributions to the party. He went door-to-door canvassing and found out how people would vote. He had turn out the vote things to people would come to their homes and take them to the polling booths. He just set up an urban political machine. And it was a magnificent effort. It relied on drawing in the immigrant votes. You had to be a property owner to vote back then. And so what he'd do is he would buy a small piece of property and give it to maybe 1,000 people, all of them listed as owners, co-owners. Then they all were property owners, so they all could vote. And all sorts of techniques. And he ended up winning, and Hamilton was fighting him tooth and nail. And it was a great clash between Hamilton and Burr that set the stage for another clash in New Jersey 4 years later. And Hamilton didn't believe he'd ever lose. And he ground together an amazing ticket of people who run. He had Horatio Gates. He was practically senile at that time. He was very old. He was he was very wealthy. I mean, he was the hero of Saratoga, but he was practically, he wasn't at his best by that time. He was even worse than when he was at Camden. And he was, but he ran as a state assemblyman. He had former governors running for the state assembly. Ticket you couldn't believe, the greatest ticket ever put together for the state assembly in New York. Washington's former postmaster general running for the state assembly. They were by the way, none of them ever went to Albany to participate except the day they had to vote for electors. But the result was he won by 400 votes. Many people still wonder if those, and people never know whether those were legitimate. They came out of the immigrant regions in the north, which people didn't even know the population of. Many Germans, many freed African Americans living up there, many people from the Caribbean living up there. They churned out to vote. And in those wards alone, he ran up big enough totals. They had turnouts that over the previous year, 20 times as many people voting than the last time, and they won by 400 votes. And that set the stage for Washington's election. So Burr was right at the center of this election, and it's a very exciting point in time. And of course, his condition for that is to be the vice presidential candidate. That's part of the deal. And they were all people who were elected. Those electors weren't going to vote for Jefferson unless Aaron Burr was on the ticket. I mean, and Jefferson was not going to win without New York. So it's part of the story, a fascinating part of the story, but it's part of the birth of the two-party political machine that we see there, and other states and modeled off after that. So, thank you. Yes? here's my, it's a fluke of the Constitution. The Constitution wasn't designed with parties in mind. And it's sort of like, like you get a cathedral, and you get, because you have cathedrals and people did art for cathedrals, that fit in spaces, like between the pillars and between the archways. And it's that sort of way. The Constitution, they wanted to have a national candidate. They were afraid that the small states were afraid that a few states, 3 states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts together had over half the American people living. And the other states thought they're just going to run everything. So we're gonna give extra electors to small states because of the way we divide it up. But to make sure we got a national candidate, and Virginia just doesn't run Virginia and Massachusetts just don't run everything forever. Those were the 2 biggest states. We're going to require that they have a majority of the electors. And the idea, or if they can't get a majority of the electors, it goes to the House of Representatives, and the House must choose by a majority of the states. The members of the House, it's a majority of the states have to, and however, in each state, even if you have 20 representatives, you still only get 1 vote. Where like Virginia, and Delaware has 1 representative, they each get 1 vote. So the idea was to have something national. And the result is it has to have a majority. And if you have to have a majority, well, you can only logically have 2 parties, because you can't build a coalition of minorities. You have to have a majority for the U.S. To become president. And I think that because of that majority requirement, which other democracies don't have that majority requirement to choose their prime minister. They can patch together a whole coalition from lots of parties, and they all. But if you can only win with the majority, you've got to coalesce into a party that could get a majority, and there can only be 2 of those. So I think it's a result of that process, because every time we've experienced with a third party, it withers away or becomes the majority party. One of the 2 contenders, and we never seem to be able to maintain more than 2. So I think it's a result of the way our structure is built. And again, the structure wasn't built with a 2-party system in mind. It was built with nonpartisan, the idea of a nonpartisan republic. Yes. It is. Was what kept a breakdown from happening? Why didn't this collapse? And it was very possible because we did not yet venerate the Constitution. The Constitution was a new document then. We had already been through 2 national governments, the Second Continental Congress and then the Articles of Confederation. And many people thought the Constitution was a very, very flawed document. It didn't envision political parties, for example. The North was already strongly abolitionist, and the Constitution enshrined slavery. There were lots of reasons, and it's unclear about whether you can have a national bank and a whole variety of issues, the Federal Reserve System, as we call it. So there was much thought that this system wouldn't survive. And it was precarious. That was another reason people were viewing this election as a catastrophe, because they didn't know what was going to come about. Now, what you had, and in part, the Constitution is ambiguous enough that it allows a lot of play. It allows the development of a 2-party democracy, even though it doesn't say anything about it. So, in part, it's because both parties could think they could, if they took over, they could make a fundamentally different system within the confines of the document they had. And Hamilton thought he could make the Constitution one way, and Jefferson thought he could make another way. They had these differences at the time of the Constitutional Convention, and yet Jefferson and Hamilton both backed the ratification of the Constitution. And Madison, who was on Jefferson's side, helped write it. So there was this difference, and they thought simply by taking could change it. And Jefferson, that's why he later called the election of 1800 the Revolution of 1800. Now, Adams thought that was crazy and vocally objected to that. So they thought they could play with the system. But why didn't it break down altogether when it got so close? Well, I think it's partly because the Democrats won. Because the Federalists were the ones most committed to the Constitution. The Federalists got their whole sense of purpose was creating the Constitution. They were the party that endorsed the ratification of the Constitution. They were the party of the Constitution. And so when this election goes toward a breakdown, and it first goes to a breakdown because you don't know who's going to win. But then at the end, it becomes clear that that the Democrats had won very, very narrowly by the very last state's vote. The voting's the last state. But then they didn't want the Democrats, they were called the Republicans back then, made a fundamental mistake. One. What had happened 4 years before was that Adams had beaten Jefferson just by 2 votes. To do under the old system. Under the old system, you have to cast 2 electoral votes. But Adams was supposed to be president, and Thomas Pinckney from South Carolina was supposed to be vice president. So a few people the only way you can make it work is have a few Federalists not vote for Pinckney so he comes in second. Well, a few too many people did. And the result was that Jefferson, who was only 2 votes behind, ends up coming in second. So he serves his 4 years as vice president. And so he has a bully pulpit presiding over the Senate, which he did every day, to attack what Adams was doing. And here was the president and vice president of the opposite parties, both with a national pulpit. Well, the Democrats didn't want that to happen again. So they won, and they thought they might have lost, they thought they might have tied, they thought they might have won by just 1 vote. So they don't let anybody off to vote. And so as a result is everybody vote. They don't want Adams to be vice president. So everybody votes for Jefferson, but they all vote for Burr too. And the result is a tie between Jefferson and Burr. Well, now Burr, the master intriguer that we've already talked about, and that's what his opponents called him. That's what even his supporters called him. But for them it was a compliment. What happens is that the Federalists see, my gosh, by now partisanship is so entrenched, we can destroy the other party by putting Burr in as president instead of Jefferson. It's not that we want Burr, but we will have put in not the person they want, somebody else. Burr might work with us because he's really not that ideological. But even if he doesn't work with us, we've just frustrated the whole opposition. And so the problem is you need a majority. Now it goes to the House of Representatives with Jefferson and Burr equal, so they have to choose between them. Everybody thought they were voting for Jefferson for president. All the Democrats thought they were voting for Jefferson, and all the Federalists thought they were voting against Jefferson. Nobody thought Burr was running for president. But you need to win by a majority of the states. And the problem is, in the House of Representatives, neither party controlled the majority of the state delegations, because 3 delegations were split with an equal number from both parties. And the result was that the Democrats had 8 states, and the Federalists had 7, and you needed 9. And so if all the Federalists stuck together, Jefferson could never win. But they could never get Burr elected either. So they were offering bribes to Republicans, because they thought Republicans, the Federalists thought they were upright and stood for principle. And they thought the Democrats were just self-interested immigrants and a rabble. And they thought they could buy some off. And it goes through 35 votes in the House of Representatives with nobody breaking. And it gets to the point where it looks like the whole government's going to break down. Because if nobody's chosen, they're getting close to Inauguration Day, and if nobody's chosen, who becomes president? Nobody knew who would become president. There wasn't any provision to what would happen if nobody's chosen. And for fear of what was happening, by this time, Virginia and Pennsylvania were taken over by the Democrats, and they had elected very partisan governors. Tom McKean, a hero of the Revolution in Pennsylvania, who'd come out of retirement to serve. He signed the Declaration of Independence, and James Monroe in Virginia. And they both call up their state militias in the middle of this voting and are threatened to march down on Washington, D.C. and force the inauguration of Thomas Jefferson. Meanwhile, the Democratic states, meanwhile, Massachusetts threatens to call up its militia and march it down, but they can't figure out how to get through New York, which will stop them. And they have to get through Pennsylvania, too, which is going to organize against them. And also, many of the Democratic states get the governors issue proclamations that if Jefferson isn't picked, the whole deal's off. The Constitution is over, and we're going to go back to the Articles of Confederation. It reached that stage at the end. And finally, though, the Federalists are committed to the Constitution, and they realize the only way to preserve the Constitution is to let Jefferson get in. And it's the representative from Delaware, which knows that who's a strong high Federalist, Bayard. And it's a little state. His father-in-law is the governor. And you know how that works in those little states. And he finally says, and of course he is the only representative, so if he switches his vote, Jefferson's got the votes, because he's one person and he can bring his state around. And he finally decides, if this union breaks, Delaware is doomed, because all states are independent, and Pennsylvania or Maryland is just going to annex us. I mean, they had hardly any people then. It was a tiny, tiny, tiny state. And the only way to preserve Delaware, he decided, was to keep the Constitution, because they get 3 electoral votes and they get 2 senators in this pipsqueak little state. They get way disproportionate representatives. And finally he says he's going to switch if under threat of what was going to happen. And that's the linchpin that breaks the dike. And then Jefferson wins at the last minute. But it comes that close. And I think it's the fact that Jefferson won keeps the Democrats involved, because they think now they can remake the government in a way that fits their ideology, which they largely do. And the Federalists go along with it because they see it's going to be the end of the constitutional union if they don't. And so we end up with the resolution, and then we get the Virginia dynasty of presidents, 3 great Virginia presidents. Jefferson doesn't rule as a radical. He rules as a very moderate president who draws on Federalists, who keeps the Navy, who uses the Navy to protect the merchant shipping against the Barbary pirates. He gets the Louisiana Purchase, which, of course, the French would have never sold Louisiana to the Federalists. They hated the Federalists, but they liked Jefferson. And the Federalists loved the Louisiana Purchase. And you end up being a different sort of, it ends up being a system that works. And then with the 3 Virginia presidents, Madison and Monroe, by that time, you have a government and a constitution that all Americans could venerate. I mean, it ran into problems in 1860, no question. But you do have a country that even Andrew Jackson could say, our union, keep it together. And that's the process. And that's one of the other things that makes it a catastrophe nonetheless. They thought it was a catastrophe, but a magnificent one. So thank you very much. Do we have time for any more, or are we all done? She's stopping me. She's stopping me. Thank you very much.